Proud supporters of Africa this week. Engine, with us, you are number one.
Welcome back to Africa This Week. The Nigerian government's planned fuel subsidy cuts may have far-reaching consequences for the country's economic structure. Ayo Obe, partner at Agunsole Shonibare Legal Practitioners, talked us through the pros and cons.
Well, I think that society remains quite hostile to the idea of deregulating the price of fuel products. Every time the government talks about this, and they've been talking about it for many years now, they always say that we will increase the price of petrol or remove the subsidy and that we will cushion the effects. The problem is that we never see the cushion. And many of us feel that if you're going to throw people out of the window, you put the cushion in place first. You don't throw people out and then start discussing the kind of cushion. And that's so that lack of visible cushion is what is making the people still hostile to the idea.
Give us an understanding of why fuel subsidies are important in Nigeria. Often we say this is the one thing that Nigerians believe is a benefit of living in an oil-rich country, is that at least refined product is partly subsidized, reducing the cost on household expenditure. How does it work?
Well, it's really not clear, and I think that part of the problem is that government keeps on talking about removing the subsidy, and they will from time to time increase the price, but without really explaining that they themselves have a full grasp of the figures. They do talk about the fact that the fuel subsidy leads to corruption and to a few people benefiting, but they don't seem to be able to explain why they have failed to get a hold of the fuel market and be able to explain why they're spending so much money and that it's going down the drain.
Nigerians, because of the electricity issues in the country, tend to use generators, and often each household has 2 generators, one specifically for the fridge and then for general domestic consumption. The fuel that's utilized in those generators, is that fuel subsidized by the government?
Well, there are 2 types of generator. I mean, there's the diesel generator, and the diesel price is not subsidized by the government, or the price is certainly very high. And then many people are turning to the petrol generator simply because they're apparently easier to maintain. And the fuel for those is obviously bought at petrol stations along with the fuel for the cars.
Okay, so inflationary risks, because obviously that's what's going to happen. You remove a subsidy, people have to dig deeper into their pockets. Unless wages are changing, it's going to create a bit of a problem.
Well, the problem is that because the people who are in charge or who are making the decisions are generally government people whose costs are subsidized by the government, or company executives whose costs are subsidized by their companies, they don't really understand how it affects ordinary people in their lives. And I think that it's that lack of imagination which is really the problem, because if that imagination about the lives of ordinary people were there, then the measures that would be necessary to alleviate it would also be in place, because it's not just a matter of increasing people's salaries and wages. People often don't have the capacity to get their salaries and wages increased, and therefore they will bear the brunt without getting the benefits that are supposed to accrue from increasing the price of petrol.
Governments are generally reluctant to pay for licensed software. This has raised tough questions about the effects it will have on the country's software development industry. Leon Lowe, Executive Director of the Free Market Foundation in Johannesburg, explained.
This is definitely the way of the future. Actually, it's the way of the present. The future is even more dramatic, which is where it won't even be in their computers, but in what's called the cloud, which means somebody else's computer in some strange part of the world where no one even knows where it is. For example, many people know, if you use Gmail, you have no idea where your email is. You just know it's not in your computer. And so the government has to go this way, and it's going, unfortunately, quite slowly. But really, most of what we do ought now to be done via the internet or via computers. And this requires very sophisticated people who know what they're doing. It requires reliable software. It requires people who provide backup and support and training. And unfortunately, the government there has made somewhat of what are probably some very serious mistakes in the way it's proceeding in the software field, which people don't realize is worth hundreds of millions of rands every year.
What are those mistakes? Because government is saying we want to use taxpayers' money efficiently, and we also want to support knowledge generation. So they lean more towards this whole idea of open source.
Yes.
But
Yes,
apparently that's problematic.
There's a myth, unfortunately, that the government's fallen for, that open source is free. Firstly, you can pay for software that's open source, or you can have free software that's not open source.
Yeah.
And the idea that there's this binary world, and open source or free and open source software is meant to be good, and proprietary or commercial software is meant to be bad. Now, this is actually a con, and unfortunately the government's fallen for this con. There is no free lunch, and no software is free, and when they call for people to come forward for procurement, which they have to do in accordance with the law and the Constitution, people don't come and say, we are tendering to provide your needs for free. They come forward and they say, we are tendering to provide your needs at a very, very high price. You have to employ us and contract with us. The software we use will be open source. But you have to employ us to provide you with the consultancy and the backup services and the training services.
And is that the element of it's not being free?
This is where it's not free. Of course it's not free. It comes very expensively, and very big commercial companies have so-called freeware, but what they're selling, of course, is they're not in a charity. They're not providing charity. They're making lots of billions and billions of rands.
Why the hype about open source, especially in an economy like South Africa?
Well, it's very strange, actually. The hype of it's a good question. Why the hype? It's almost as if there's a kind of fuzzy feeling, as if it's somehow nice, you know. There's something nice about it, and commercial is not nice. It's just nonsense, actually. It's a very strange thing, and the people who promote it and make lots of money out of it have created a myth which really people in government should not fall for, and they have, that it's free. It's not in fact free. There is a lot of true free software, you know, apps on your iPhone and your Android phone and so on, genuinely where young enthusiasts and hobbyists and geeks having fun produce lots of freeware, but serious freeware that would run government systems, education systems, court systems, the army, the Department of Finance. That is not free. It never has been and never will be.
When you talk about, things increasingly moving into the cloud, it raises the question of national security, because a lot of the information that flows between the taxman or the taxpayer and the government would be classified information in many respects, and we're seeing government pushing for restraints when it comes to classified information through the Public Information Bill. What happens on the internet side of things?
Yes, the cloud is actually more secure. So for the government to keep it's much less likely to be hacked through the cloud than it is when it's got its own software with its own very low-level people running it. And not low-level because government, but compared to the people who work out there running the cloud, these are the world's most sophisticated programmers with the most sophisticated encryption and security systems. Actually, the problem with the cloud is that it's too secure. The government has the problem that if you do all your personal affairs, your finance, your banking, your correspondence in the cloud, it can no longer bug you. It can no longer find out what you're up to the way it can now by listening into your cell phone conversations and going into your computer by hacking into it and so on.
In the near future, the size and prestige of a nation's university system will become an index of its economic potential. We now take a look at lessons on education for a competitive world with Murdoch University Vice-Chancellor Professor John Granger. He spoke to Alicia Seckham.
I think we can learn from the UAE in that they have had to move from zero to a higher education system of world repute within a matter of 30 years. They're very fortunate in that they have the gross national product in the form of oil and tourism and so on, but it is a remarkable achievement. And we are in that market, and it's fast growing and healthy. I think a lot of countries have made a mistake of licensing bodies that can issue degrees without that backup, without that check, without the checks and balances. And the worst possible scenario is when a student comes out thinking that they have a qualification that is worth something, and they get into the marketplace and they find that the university or the business school that they studied with is not accredited in the country or outside the country. And then there's disappointment. And there's also a certain amount of there's an issue attached to it, because if you produce a degree that is not a proper degree, your employer immediately becomes suspicious about your credentials. So accreditation and a form of monitoring of educational standards, that's vital. That's vital. The other issue is, I think that we've got to realize that our education starts with the young children. The UAE had, for many years, there was a a problem with students coming through from the high school system to the university system. Lower levels of English and most of the higher education institutions actually offer English degrees. And the system was not particularly robust when it came to the teaching of a second language. So they've got that right now, and they start with English language lessons right at the very beginning of the child's in pre-primary, and they increase that level of intensity all the way through. With the result, we're now getting, after about 14, 15 years, we're getting students from the national system who are English oriented. They can speak and they can communicate in English. And that, I think, the whole world is English-centric at the moment.
Absolutely, and where you've got Africa part of that global economic network, yes, that one of the criteria, you know, that needs to be set in place. What role do you see private institutions like Murdoch University playing in developing systems like these moving forward?
Murdoch is an innovative university. We can see from our experiences around the world, Singapore, Dubai, in Perth, we're back in Perth, and also in Malaysia, we've got an overview of all the educational systems that we're in. I think that we can assist in offering top quality qualifications to people who will make a difference in the education market. Well, for example, we have a Masters of Education in the UAE that is helping teachers to come to grips with the problems. I think there would be a particularly large market in South Africa for our assistance in helping. I know that there's a program, for example, Warwick University send a batch of maths teachers on a regular basis to South Africa. They send them out into the bush and they assist the teachers. I think your level of education is going to be incremental if you make the level of retraining of teachers incremental.
Well, that's all for this edition of Africa This Week. Join us again next week for another roundup of the top stories in Africa. From me, Mashudu Masuta, and the team, it's goodbye.